This is the Gloster Gladiator, which, believe it or not, is a World War II fighter, commissioned by the Royal Air Force. It's the last of the RAF's biplanes, delivered in 1937. I have to say I'm caught up in the whole nostalgia thing about any biplane at all, really. When I was growing up, I read all the Richard Bach books, Stephen Kuntz, Cannibal Queen, Derek Robinson, Goshawk Squadron, about First World War aerial combat. Excellent book. Films, of course, The Great Waldo Pepper with Robert Redford, George Peppard in The Blue Max, all of that stuff. So I can't see a biplane without all that nostalgia for a time I never knew, obviously, without that creeping in. First thing I saw of this particular biplane was somebody over in the Orbix forums posted some screenshots, and it was just absolutely gorgeous. I mean, right away it was a beautiful plane, so I went immediately, had to go and look for it, and I found it. It's a payware package for FSX only by a small company, Icarusgold, in Italy. Downloaded from their website, $22, probably about £15. Got to say, slightly disappointed right off the bat. The plane looks as good as I expected it to look on the outside anyway. I'll maybe say a bit about the interior later. What was disappointing was there's very little, actually no let's call a spade, no documentation with this aircraft. Very disappointing. No notes at all on how to fly this aircraft. So usually with a payware package like this, you'd expect to find at least minimal handling information. Stalling speed, approach speed, takeoff speed, if you're lucky, best rate of climb, best angle of climb, things like that. Ideally, you'd also get notes on general handling, the fuel system, engine procedures, but there's nothing here. Not even, I mean, sometimes you get a checklist. No checklists with this. Nothing on the FSX knee board, no reference information at all. Very disappointing. So the last resort really is to figure it out yourself. That's what I did next. Took this airplane up, fly it around, quickly figured out the stall speed 70 knots. Not long after that I figured out that the stall speed with full flaps is also 70 knots. In fact, extending the flaps has absolutely no effect at all. You can see them come down on the wings. There's a visual animation there, you can hear the noise, but they have absolutely no effect on the airspeed, on the pitch, on the rate of climb and descent. Absolutely no indication at all that they're down. And I've got to say, it undermines the whole idea that this is a credible model of the aircraft if basic functionality like that doesn't work. I did try and take advice from the Icarusgold forums on this. Did get a response from the developer. Not a very helpful response, I have to say. Very defensive, told me to edit the configuration files. Unfortunately, the tweaks they told me to do in the config file had absolutely no effect. When I mentioned this, that was the last I heard. So anyway, the end result of all that for me is effectively this aircraft doesn't have flaps, which makes landing quite a challenge. So this whole idea of expecting me to tweak configuration files to make the performance more realistic, or even to establish basic functionality, doesn't seem like my job, frankly, in a payware aircraft. It suggests to me that the package isn't really finished. And then to find they're releasing add-on packages already with extra paint jobs in, you have to question their priorities. And maybe that's the point, really. This is a very well finished aircraft externally. Comes with a huge number of paint jobs. There's just a few of them shown here. I think you get something like 28 or 30 different paint schemes with the package. There's another 4 you can download, and then there's an add-on package you can buy, which has got something like another 15. And I think this really gives the measure of this developer. It seems to be a bunch of people who've got a particular interest in modelling authentically the look and the period paint schemes of the aircraft. So, having said all that, how does this aeroplane fly? Well, obviously it flies to some approximation of realism, and it is quite challenging. Now, I've never actually flown a Gloster Gladiator, so maybe what we should be looking for in a situation like this is some sense of authenticity as opposed to realism. This is a tail dragger, of course, makes it very difficult to handle on the ground, even taxiing in calm conditions as we are here. You can't see where you're going. Very poor forward visibility. That's also going to be an issue when we're coming on the approach, especially as the flaps don't work. Bit of zigzagging required for taxiing on the ground if you're going to do it authentically, by which I mean not using the external views. Now also, this is something of a muscle plane. That's a 25 litre 9-cylinder radial engine up front, puts out about 840 horsepower, and all this in a package weighing less than a Cessna 172. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, if you expect this to fly like a Cessna 172, you're in for a bit of a rude awakening. So if you've had any proper flying lessons, you probably vaguely remember something about the aircraft wanting to turn left when you're going through the takeoff. The torque reaction of the engine. Crankshaft spins one way with the propeller. The aircraft wants to spin the opposite direction. Something like a Cessna 152, the effect barely significant, needs slight correction with the rudder for that and the other effects. Much more significant than an aircraft like this. Now another reason it wants to turn is that propeller up front, effectively a 10.5, 11-foot gyroscope, and this being a tail dragger, when you lift the tail you're making a significant rotation in the pitch of that gyroscope, and if you know anything about gyroscopes you know that causes a perpendicular reaction, in this case wanting to yaw the aircraft to the left. Now I'm saying left because that's what you'll be taught if you learn to fly on a Cessna 152. This isn't a Cessna 152. If you watch closely here you'll see something interesting. That propeller's spinning anti-clockwise, which means the torque reaction should be clockwise. In other words, rotating the aircraft onto its right wheel. If you watch here, that's clearly not happening. We're getting torque reaction to the left with the propeller. This might be a good point to say something about realism in FSX. If you've got realism settings turned down, or if you've got auto coordination turned on, very little to distinguish this aircraft from any other piston-engined aircraft, other than its brutal power, its rate of climb perhaps. The plane will pretty much take off by itself. On the contrary, if you've got auto coordination off, you're going to need a set of rudder pedals for this plane just to get it off the ground. Realism settings wound up high. It is very, very challenging just to get the damn thing off the ground. Maybe too challenging, I don't know. But that's what this is about. You know, in my book, this is about the challenge of flying an aircraft like this. Better way to get to grips with it is to pick a nice airfield and just barge it around the circuit a few times, or a few dozen times I should say, which is what I'm doing here, flying very tight, very low circuits just to keep things interesting. This thing, as soon as you get off the ground you've got to wind the power back almost to idle, otherwise it's off like a rocket. What I've discovered is keep it under 100 knots in the circuit, otherwise it's almost impossible to make it come down. Remember the flaps aren't working. Under 100 knots, great, stalls at 70, got a bit of a margin for error there. It's quite unstable in pitch, you can't just expect to trim it and let go, you've got to keep an eye on that speed. Apart from that, pretty good view out of the cockpit. You've got a wing above you, but it's in front of you, so you've got a good, when you're into a turn you can have a look, see where you're going. Just on the cockpit, I mean the gauges are modelled, they look pretty good from a distance. They're not very high resolution gauges, so they don't stand zooming in too readily. I think what I don't like about it is it's very clean looking, which doesn't necessarily match the paint jobs, which are very dirty down, authentic, you know, used looking paint jobs. I think more than that, it's the away from the panel inside the cockpit. Everything looks not just clean but undetailed. Some of the gauges, you know, again back to documentation, I don't know what they're for. Nothing about engine management procedures. You know, you've got a throttle and a mixture control, that's all. There's a fuel pump. I discovered there's a fuel pump by accident. I have the Cytec switch panel. I flicked the fuel pump switch just to see if anything happened, and yeah, lo and behold, the pump started up. No idea when you're supposed to use that. Now, something about the approach on an aircraft like this, traditional with a big tail dragger, to fly something of a curved approach, and maybe to make use of side slipping, just so you can keep the runway in sight. So I'm hoping to have a bit of a go at that here, demonstrate it. Got to say, the prospect of stalling something like this should be a bit more scary than it actually is with this model. If this thing stalls, you can catch it easily with or without the throttle. I mean, if you've got enough height, you can easily recover just by putting your nose down. All you got to do is blip the throttle and you start rocketing up again. Not quite sure how realistic that is. Landing itself, as long as you keep it sideways, get a good view until the last minute, pretty easy. Kick it straight, round it out and just hold it off. You get a fairly relaxed stall onto the ground. It is quite fast landing, so kind of difficult to keep it straight on the pedals. And again, once you're down, you can't see where the hell you're going, so quite tricky. So conclusions, gorgeous looking airplane on the outside. If you want to make films or take screenshots, brilliant piece of kit. Don't expect too much from the flight model, very challenging to fly as I say, which is fun in itself, as long as you've got realism turned up. I've got to say though, swapping back to a much more refined paywear aircraft like the Real Air Scout really does suggest how rough and ready the flight model of this one is. At the end of the day, I think what you're buying here is the visual model. The flight model is clearly a secondary priority. I was going to say this aircraft not cheap. It's up there with the likes of Carinado cost-wise, but having said that, you do get enormous variety in the paintwork, and to me, clearly that's what this company's about. They're into the nostalgia factor, very authentic modelling of the exteriors of their aircraft and the paintwork. So if that's what you're after, you know, I'd consider buying another one of their aircraft. If you ever do a Fairchild C119 or a Lockheed Electra L10, I'll be at the front of the queue.